With 8 factions on launch, Warhammer 3 has got one of the most diverse starting lineups we've ever seen, even before Immortal Empires hits the scene. Each of them have their own unique playstyles, and I've covered them all in their own separate guides, but watching them all would take a pretty long time, so I thought I'd make this video to give you a one-stop shop to learn how each faction plays, so you can decide who to pick up for your first, second, or whatever campaign you're on. But first, new merch alert. We've got the brand new class of 2022 featuring totally original characters, as well as the epic gamer runic caps. The store is linked in the description if you'd like to take a closer look. Now, onto the video. Kislev, the wall that keeps chaos from the world, but not the actual wall, that's the other guys. Kislev's campaign is based around uniting the motherland and keeping out demons. You can unite the motherland by grinding spores and devotion. Spores push you further ahead in the general election, and the two choices are conservative males or conservative females. So more or less like normal elections, but with more females. Devotion allows you to invoke the motherland to choose one of 4 effects to place in your entire faction for a number of turns, as well as allowing you to gain more supporters for performing certain actions. They also have a very unique system of settlement building, with most of the settlements in their lands only able to reach a max size of 3, with the exception of the main 3 cities, which you should capture as soon as possible. You can also place Atmans to govern half of your provinces and provide all sorts of buffs and effects, depending on who you pick and the choices they make. And finally, they have a unique approach to mage recruitment, with each one having to go through a rigorous 6-turn program before they can be recruited, meaning losing them in a single turn to an assassin or a well-placed army camping your lands really has never felt so good. In battle, Kislev rely on 2 main things: missiles and bears. On the missile side of things, you have a ton of hybrid weapons infantry that can fight in melee just as well as they can fire from a range and do some passable damage in each. Of course, being the jack of a number of trades does end up meaning they're the master of none, so just make sure to bring plenty more units than you need, just to be safe. On the bear side, you have bears that heroes and lords ride on, bears ridden by guys with spears, and of course big bears made from ice and earth. These are normally all your best units, and you want to bring a ton of them to tear apart the enemy lines with ease. Of course, they're vulnerable to ranged fire, being such chunky lads, so get on the enemy as soon as possible to shut that down before you need to worry. Alongside these 2 things, Kislev also have some nice stuff infantry and a couple of really powerful lords of magic, so while they may not have the most choice right now, they're still a decent pick, if not the most specialised. As mentioned earlier, your lord choices here are comprised of conservative Elsa after she was radicalised, and basically just Rasputin. Also Elsa's dad, who is incredibly wide and loves bears even more than the average Kislevite.
Damn, Daniel.
The Demons of Chaos campaign are kind of like a DC superhero movie. They look really cool in trailers, but when you see them for real, they are pretty underwhelming and just a little bit boring, but at least you have a handsome lad to look at. The only mechanic that is truly their own is the Build a Demon mechanic, which allows you to unlock different pieces of Daniel here as you dedicate more and more favour to each of the 5 branches of Chaos. Post 1.1 patch, this is a lot more impactful, and he can really become a beast once you get some good items online. But this still only benefits your one army, so aside from that, the rest of your faction doesn't really have a lot unique to play with. They do steal some mechanics from other factions to make up for this, but quite like Beerate Sports Ground, the shit is watered down. You have a light version of Bloodletting from Khorne, some weaker switchable plagues from Nurgle, a small seduction budget from Slaanesh, and the teleport movement stance from Tzeentch. If you're looking for a faction that combines everything from everyone, then you'll need to keep looking. But if you want just a taste, Daniel is the chap for you. In battle, this is where Daniel and his faction really shine. You really do get access to nearly every single unit from all 4 of the Chaos rosters, adding up to a roster that is somewhere in the realm of 80 units. This means you can go for any strategy from any of the other 4 branches of Chaos, or choose a mix of each. If you want a high damage front lines of Khorne, the devastating cav of Slaanesh, the powerful ranged firepower of Tzeentch, and the raw sexual magnitude of Nurgle, you can. For me, this roster is the main draw of the Demons of Chaos, as this much choice adds up to a lot of fun experimenting with armies. And as for your lord choices, you only have poor Daniel here. We might see Bellicort added too if Mortal Empires ever comes out, but for now, it's just damn Daniel.
The magic dragon lived by the sea.
Cathay. These guys are the actual wall to keep chaos out, but rather than extend it to protect all of mankind in the world, they only protect themselves and their own lands. How selfish. Cathay is all about balance, which is ironic in a game from the same series as Skaven. Harmony flows through everything the faction does, from buildings to research to characters, and maintaining the balance between yin and yang is the key to prosperity across all of your lands. Keeping this balance will be a campaign-long task, as everything throws it into disarray and causes you to be constantly fighting one way or the other to get back into the middle. Alongside this, they must also maintain the big-ass wall we mentioned earlier. It has 3 gates controlling them that will lower the risk of demons coming and knocking. Of course, they often will come and knocking anyway, and when that does happen, you'll need to defend them, which should be easy, in settlements have their back open to the lands of Cathay, which should allow you to ship in supplies to avoid attrition. But no, they'll suffer attrition and need to either attack out and take down the enemy that way, or wait until they are slowly picked off from said attrition like any other base cast settlements. They of course have more mechanics aside from these two, because no faction in Warhammer 3 can be free of bloat on day 1. They have the Woojing Compass, which lets them pick one of 4 buffs every few turns, which is essentially a slight rip-off of the gifts from Grombrindle or the old Dark Moon mechanic from the Beastmen, but I digress. And finally, they have the Ivory Road, which allows them to send trade caravans out into the world to complete trades for gold and items, which essentially ends up being a light, choose-your-own-adventure game with a shitload of cash at the end. In battle, Cathay are known for one thing and one thing only: gunpowder, baby. It is the key to all of their most powerful units, and allows them to tear enemies to pieces from afar with high armor piercing and range. Of course, they are therefore incredibly weak versus flanking enemies that get on them quickly, and take out their ranged units before they can do anything, but if you manage to keep them safe, you should do quite well. Alongside gunpowder, they also have some decent front lines, great cav, and an excellent construct in the form of the Terracotta Sentinels. And of course, it wouldn't make sense if they didn't have the casters of Yin and Yang, alongside Heavens and even Metal, making them one of the most magically diverse factions in the game so far, at least until Mortal Empires comes out. All hail the Emperor. Playing them is a weird mix of turtling with a spot of micro to keep everything safe, whilst also flanking the enemy and diving their front lines with your constructs. And of course, it wouldn't be Cathay without harmony. Each unit is either yin or yang and has to be next to the opposite balance to stay at peak physical performance, so add a little more micro to go with your micro. And finally, your lord choices here are between the daughter that the parents actually like and the son that the parents don't like but is mates with ogres because of said daddy issues.
I present to you my spy in the Ministry of Defense. Fat bastard.
First things first, where's your shitter? I've got a turtle head poking out.
Ogres really are an all-star faction, and are probably some of the most fun you can have in the game right now. They're basically true neutral since they don't care who they're fighting against, as long as there's a plentiful supply of meat and or gold at the end of it. Gold is of course useful for all kinds of things, just like any other faction, but meat is something just for the ogres. It allows them to become even fatter with pre-battle feasts, upkeeping particularly chunky units, and of course sacrifices to the Great Maw in exchange for all kinds of bonuses. To aid them in making both of these currencies, they take on contracts from basically anyone and are more of a hammer than a scalpel, as most contracts see you taking down an army or settlement by any means possible. Once your ogres have completed certain actions, they can also become renowned with a great name providing them with bonuses relating to that certain action. These can be anything from stat changes for them and their army to entirely new abilities only unlockable via these names. And finally, they can also form camps around the map, which are their true settlements, as actual settlements are only really good for a bit of dollar. Camps let them recruit late game units, as well as providing all sorts of effects for armies in their radius. As well as this, they can allow your armies to recruit these late game units even when in enemy territory, making them 100% balanced. In battle, the chonk continues, with the majority of the roster being comprised of chunky lads that bolt through the enemies and do big boy damage. Their large size but small number often results in tiny armies that pack a hell of a punch despite their massive numbers disadvantage. This means you have to use that large mass to press the attack as hard as possible, as giving the enemy time to breathe will likely result in you becoming overwhelmed rather than them. Aside from all the thick boys, you also have some even thicker boys in the form of your monsters, as well as some incredibly powerful ranged units. You also have their exclusive Law of the Maw, alongside fire and beast casters, so their magic is nothing to scoff at. Basically, big boys, big damage, big power, and normally big fun. And finally, your lord choices here are literally Fat Bastard with a turkey leg and a bedazzled pimp cane, or Master Chef, Mountains of Morn edition.
Oh my god, it's Khorne.
I mean, do I really need to explain how to play Khorne? You literally just fight constantly, and that's about it. Moving on to Nurgle now. Okay, fine. Okay, if you actually want to know, they do have quite a few mechanics, but they are basically all based around fighting. You collect skulls from fighting, whether you win or lose, and these can be spent on a bunch of stuff, including the Skull Throne, which makes your armies better for a little bit. Drawn to Destruction allows you to automatically colonize runes in provinces you own a settlement in, so occupy once and raise the rest for easy expansion. Bloodletting literally just means you get stronger the more you fight, so keep doing it to keep getting stronger. And finally, you can make use of cults and unholy manifestations for various effects, just like the rest of Chaos. So yeah, basically just keep fighting and spreading your corruption as you do, and you'll do pretty well. Of course, Khorne's roster is pretty much focused on all-out offense with a ton of high damage units with little care for defense. They have some great frontline units alongside powerful monsters and cav units, which allow them to close the gap between themselves and the enemies in no time. And to top it all off, they have the one and only artillery unit, the Skull Cannon, which literally tosses enemy skulls back at them. With very few ranged units and not a lot of defense, Khorne is truly a head-on attack faction, and you want to press onto enemies as quickly and constantly as possible. As for your lord choices, we just have Skybrand at the moment, which is pretty funny since Khorne doesn't even really like him and has cast him out of his realm, meaning you're playing as Khorne as a faction that pretty much hates Khorne. Sounds pretty Khorne if you ask me.
Uh-oh. Stinky poop. Poopies.
Nurgle has one of the weirdest gameplays of any Warhammer 3 faction, and for that matter, pretty much any Warhammer faction, and for that matter, any faction. Rather than the usual rapid early expansion followed by the slower mid and late game, Nurgle is slow right from the start, making him into one of the strangest and often most infuriating factions to play early on. That being said, it can be a lot of fun once you get going. You do have a lot of tools in your chest to keep things interesting. For example, you can craft plagues to spread through your lands and eventually the world, which will grant various effects, bad and good, for enemies and yourself respectively. You also build buildings in a totally different way to any other faction, with each of them being cyclical and offering different effects based on what part of the cycle they're on. Recruitment is also different, with your cyclical buildings adding units to a joint recruitment pool, which can be summoned immediately at low health, meaning you then need to find some replenishment before you send them out into the world, so you may as well just recruit normally, but I digress. And finally, like all chaos, you have the cults and unholy manifestations, so play slowly, spread plagues as often as you can, and make the most of the powerful effects they bring. In combat, their slowness continues, with many of the units being significantly slower than similar units from other factions. They make up for this by being extremely tanky, with many units having massively high HP pools, even if they don't have a ton of armor. They also have a ton of poison damage across the board, meaning if they get into combat, whatever they touch is going to have a much harder time. This boils down to a battle gameplay where you aren't going to take down enemies at any good speed, you're instead going to whittle them down slowly and outlast them until you do. Use their beefy front lines and monsters combined with their limited but powerful range troops. You also have some decent laws with the exclusive lore of Nurgle and Death, so spells will make an appearance in your battles and have quite an impact. As for lord choices, for Nurgle so far, you just have big, plague pappy, prize-winning scientist, Kugath. He's alright, but with no one to compare him to, he's just alright.
Jesus Christ, Frank.
Slaanesh has probably the most unique of the Chaos campaigns, with him actually being able to partake in diplomacy with other factions. Granted, it's not in the standard way with most factions, but still. You can put factions under your seductive influence by interacting with them in pretty much any way. This influence eventually allows you to unlock various packs like non-aggression packs, trade agreements, and even vassalization once you reach the maximum. As well as this, they can seduce enemy units pre-battle to seal them for that single battle to turn the tide in their favour and literally turn enemies against themselves. They also gain devotees wherever they go, which allows them to spread their cults more easily, raise additional armies, and grant various effects to their settlements. They also literally have the ability to spread their effects to those they come into contact with, so pretty much have army STDs, which is pretty unique. And finally, they of course have the cults and manifestations, so spread that corruption far and wide wherever possible. I'm getting tired of saying this one because all chaos have it. Slaanesh in battle have one of the biggest skill ceilings, since almost all of their most powerful units are Cavan chariots. Of course, they also have some great monsters, but for the most part, it's the speedy lads that will be doing most of the damage for you. This does mean you need to really keep on top of your micro to use them well, so if you're looking for a faction for easy battles, it might be worth skipping these lads for now. They're still pretty dang strong, don't get me wrong, but they can be a little bit fiddly. They also have their own unique lore alongside the lore of shadows, and both can do some great work in your battles, so be sure to bring some casters along for the ride. And for your lore choices right now, you just have Nakari. And he's alright, but again, we don't have any real thing to compare him to.
Go!
And finally, we have Magical Bird Boy. Of course, being Tzeentch, this campaign is based almost entirely around magic and general fuckery with fate and stuff. For starters, they can manipulate the winds of magic in regions they own a settlement in, allowing them to funnel them where needed and seriously increase the amount of magic they can sling out in combat. Alongside this, they can spend magic to teleport, which is essentially a slightly better underways, and it also makes them the only factions who have a movement stance like this playable in the game so far, apart from Daniel. But he steals it from them, so I'll let him off. Collecting grimoires allows them to change the ways and take part in some of the aforementioned fuckery. They can do too many things to list here, but just to let you know one, they can transfer ownership of settlements between factions, and there isn't much that can be done to counter this. Finally, they also have the cults and manifestations like the rest of Chaos, so spreading that good stuff really has never been more important. Their combat is also basically focused on magic, since it's the major damage in the roster, alongside some of the most foul ranged units we've seen outside of Skaven. They can wipe enemies with stupidly high missile strength, and there are very few units that they can't deter with a single volley. Alongside this, they have a passable mix of some meh infantry, decent cav and a few monsters, but really the missiles and magic is where it's at, so make sure you collect Winds of Magic on the campaign map and get ready to spend them once you get into battle, as there isn't much that can output more damage than Tzeentch with plenty of winds to play with. As mentioned, you just have access to the two-headed big bird for now, and again no comparison means he's alright, and we'll see just how alright he is as more lords get added, if that ever happens. And that's every faction in Warhammer 3 explained. I hope you enjoyed this video, let me know if you did with a like or a dislike, subscribe if you want to see more content like this, and as mentioned at the start, check out the merch store to support the channel. Speaking of support, I'd like to take this time to thank all supporters of the channel, in particular Adam T, Dominic Schmass, and of course Henry Tucker for his support at that Unclean Ones tier. If you'd like to become a supporter and get a shout out on the end screen, you can become a member here on YouTube, sub on Twitch, or join the Patreon. All supporters get shout outs at the end of videos, just like all of these wonderful people. Massive thank you to all supporters, one final thank you for watching, and for now, I've been COLONELDAMNEDERS, and I will see you next turn.